Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of What If Izuku Was a Former Mercenary. The fanfic is in the description. This is chapter 3 and 4, feel free to read along. Enjoy! The evening had barely begun, and Shoko Todoroki, heiress to the house of Todoroki, was already getting bored. That was not a state of affairs that boded well for anyone, really. Boredom meant idleness, something that was unacceptable. It meant that she had surveyed the ever-shifting landscape of politics and high society, and found it lacking, unable to keep up with the sharpness of her mind. The only correct course of action in such a situation was to add some spice, a shame most of the ways she could do that were, generally, frowned upon at a betrothal celebration. It was difficult to identify any specific cause of her disquiet. It wasn't the atmosphere. The Kurashima estate, while not the equal of her family's or the Yagi's, was quite ornate, and its great hall was a masterpiece of marble and mahogany, thousand-piece chandeliers twinkling above seas of light and beautiful decorations. The main floor had been cleared for dancing, and dozens of balconies layered the walls, turning the space into a three-dimensional tableau of ornate beauty and aristocratic excess. Nor was it the company. While there was no shortage of fools and idiots among the nobility, Shoko's lack of patience with them, and her legendary acid tongue, had quite effectively cleared them out of her immediate circle of confidants. She had high standards. There were less than half a dozen young nobles, all of them women who had earned enough of her respect and trust, a very difficult thing to do indeed, to be considered something like her inner circle. Not friends. Shoko didn't really do friends. More like allies. Those were much simpler, and much easier to cast off if it became necessary. At the moment, most of those were elsewhere, enjoying the celebrations. It wasn't every day one of their number got engaged, after all. So, if it wasn't the atmosphere, or the company, what could it be? It certainly wasn't the wine, which was excellent. The goblet in her hand was gleaming, already partially drained as she surveyed the swirling patterns of the dance floor beneath her, standing on a balcony she had claimed for herself. Perhaps, then, this was the idleness of someone looking out over an environment they had utterly mastered. After all, she had. As she looked out over the gala, Shoko could name every person she saw beneath her, their house affiliation, their quirk, their agenda, business interests, rivalries, feuds, alliances, all of it. They were all like strings, tangling together into webs that could be plucked or trimmed just so, to produce whatever effect she desired. Shoko didn't consider herself a puppet master or anything so grand. Quite frankly, trying to manipulate the whole social and political structure of the noble houses sounded exhausting. There were thousands of them, most very small and comparatively poor, with perhaps 200 or 300 of real significant power, and a few dozen which could be considered great houses. Wealth and status were the currency of this world and, of course, quirks, without which one was not noble at all, and the fortunes of whole houses could turn in a day, if they played their cards right, or wrong. These galas were more than parties, they were the forums, the arenas of the endless battle for survival and power among the houses. A business deal negotiated here, a marriage deal, a feud, these were the things that defined a house's future, or lack thereof. It was the great game, and Shoko was the grandmaster. She'd had to be. Her father would have accepted nothing less, after all. She'd grown up in this world, been molded by it, she was both its product, and its unquestioned master. Every decision was calculated perfectly, from her dress, a deep, shimmering blue tonight, frosted with white like snow, narrow and clinging to her hips, accentuated with long gloves that came up past her elbows, to her position, to those she surrounded herself with. And still, she found herself bored. This gala held nothing new for her. The same petty feuds, the same scheming, the same men and women playing out the same songs, the same patterns. This place held no danger for Shoko, she was in her element. Which also meant that, at times like this, she sometimes felt like a mountaineer who had summited the greatest mountain of all, only to stand atop it, look around, and wonder what could possibly come next, now that she had succeeded. This was all a moot point, in the end, though. Boredom was as temporary as other emotions, and would be dealt with when she found something sufficiently interesting to hold her attention, something worth picking apart and investigating. Failing that, perhaps she could find other diversions. Shoko stirred herself from her thoughts as footsteps heralded another person joining her on the balcony. It was a tall woman with onyx hair in an elaborate spiked ponytail, wearing a red, sequined dress with deep cleavage and one side longer than the other, a fascinating contrast between modesty and tantalizing exposure. "Lady Todoroki," she said formally, her lips curved upwards in a mysterious smile. "I've been looking all over for you." Shoko grinned, ever so slightly. She stood, and said in an equally formal voice, "Lady Yayorozu. And why might you be looking for me?" Lady Momo Yayorozu didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply returned Shoko's smile, and held her gaze until both women's facades cracked, ever so slightly, and they shared a laugh at their binaritualized joke of a greeting. Shoko might not do friends, but if she did, Momo was just about the only one she had, and a good one at that. They were a fearsome duo. Momo was perhaps the second most capable political manipulator of their generation of nobles, something Shoko had realized when they were young children only starting to dip their toes into the world of nobility. Naturally, she'd done the logical thing, made her into the closest ally she had, to ensure she would never be a rival. It had worked brilliantly. She and Momo had been inseparable ever since. Of course, part of that was also probably due to Momo's one great weakness: she, unlike Shoko, had something of a heart. "I didn't see you on the dance floor," Momo replied, by way of explanation. "So I figured you were up in a place like this, doing your whole, mwahaha, I am the Ice Queen, all shall fear me, routine and lording over everyone." Shoko chuckled. "You got me. I do enjoy lording over people," she confirmed, turning to the small table tucked into the alcove of the balcony, where a second, untouched wineglass was sitting. She picked it up, then offered it to Momo, who took it gratefully, though she did stare at it for a moment. "You knew I would come find you, didn't you?" she concluded after a moment. Shoko said nothing, but the twinkling amusement in her eyes as she drank from her own glass said everything. Momo sighed, and joined the toast. For a minute or two, the two noblewomen simply stared down at the party below, the sounds of music and laughter floating up to the balcony. At last, Momo broke the silence. "Any particular reason you weren't dancing?" she asked. Shoko shrugged. "Not really," she admitted. "I just didn't see the point." Momo raised an eyebrow at that. "Forgive me if I find that hard to believe," she replied. "There's always a point with you. Everything you do, you've got a reason for. Usually several, in my experience." Shoko grinned again. "Which means I'm getting predictable," she shot back. "I need to be more spontaneous, to keep people from being able to figure me out." That earned her an even more incredulous look from Momo, who gave her a heaving sigh, followed by a look. Shoko relished making Momo give her that look. It was a capitulation, an admission that Momo had no goddamn idea what was going through Shoko's head, that their game had run its course, and she would very much like to be clued in now. "Thank you very much." What made it even funnier was, well, Shoko was telling the truth. "I don't have some scheme I'm planning for tonight or anything so nefarious," she answered, hand hanging over the railing as she stared out over the chandeliers. "I just don't feel the need to dance with a bunch of foolish, arrogant men tonight." Momo snorted. "That's sort of your job, you know," she pointed out. "You're a young, unmarried noblewoman at an engagement ball. It's in the air." "What's in the air?" Shoko asked. "Other than too much cigar smoke and perfume?" Rather than respond, Momo spared a glance for the engaged couple at the center of the dance beneath them. Lord Ajiro had an arm around his intended's waist, a bright smile splitting his shark-toothed mouth. It was hard to blame him. Lady Mina Ashido was quite the catch. Powerful quirk, gorgeous, unique appearance with her pink skin, black eyes, and horns, and with a sharp mind hidden behind that beaming expression. It was an arranged marriage, of course there was no other kind, for nobles, but it seemed to contain genuine fondness, which almost made Shoko feel a little jealous. She knew better than to expect that. She didn't even want that, really. After all, her own parents had supposedly started as a love match, and look how that had turned out. The scar on her face, the mark of shame she wore like a badge of honor, burned hot for a moment, then went cold again. Momo turned to her again, those clever eyes of her searching, probing for weakness. She found none. Of course, Shoko was unreadable when she wanted to be, a marble statue in red and white. Is that why you were up here? Momo asked, half playful. Bemoaning how you're rapidly becoming an old maid? Shoko snorted. Hardly, she replied. I'll have you know I'm still the most desired bachelorette in Japan, thank you very much. Momo shrugged. A shame half the eligible young noblemen in this country are too terrified of your reputation to approach you for anything more than a greeting, she teased. Shoko grinned once more, and this smile was not a pleasant thing. It was vicious, all bared canines, and predatory light. And the other half are too terrified of what I'll do to them if they try, she agreed. If you haven't noticed, Yamamoto, most men are idiots, and I have no intention of marrying an idiot. Momo chuckled softly, clearly agreeing with her, but her face soon softened again. She leaned out over the balcony, her wineglass nearing empty already. You might not get the choice, she muttered. We are, after all, starting to run low on options. Shoko narrowed her eyes thoughtfully. Momo wasn't wrong. With Lord Ajiro now taken off the board. Who's left, anyway? She asked thoughtfully. I swear, there's been so many engagements and weddings recently, I fear I've lost track. She hadn't, of course, but it was making conversation, and besides, she liked to let Momo feel included. Momo shrugged. Not many, especially those you'd be willing to tolerate, she admitted. There's, what, Lord Kaminari? Shoko rolled her eyes. I just said I'm not marrying an idiot, she pointed out, chuckling. Not even a funny idiot? Momo asked, eyebrow raised. Shoko shook her head. Besides, she pointed out, you've heard the rumors, same as I have. Momo nodded at that. You think they're true then? She asked. Probably, she answered. He'll be engaged in a month or two at this point. Momo winced. I'm honestly not sure who I feel worse for in that marriage, she muttered. Lord Denki, or Lady Ibera. She had a point. For every compatible couple arranged marriage is produced, like Lord Ajiro and Lady Mina, or even functional ones like Momo's own parents who did not love each other, and made no secret of it, but had come to share a mutual fondness and respect that made their lives bearable if nothing else. Sometimes the demands of power-hungry parents and lack of options produced brewing messes like the seemingly inevitable betrothal of the deeply devout, rather judgmental Lady Ibera Shiozaki with the somewhat hapless Lord Denki Kaminari, who was not a bad man, but whose womanizing tendencies had earned him Shoko's ire more than once. His prospective wife was unlikely to take any kinder of a view towards him, either. It was a match between two people who were, while both fundamentally decent, also extremely incompatible, and everyone knew it. Still, when lives were business, sometimes cold profit took priority. Shoko shrugged. Be like me, she suggested. Stop caring about how much of a disaster it's going to be, and just start laughing at how funny it is instead. Momo raised her head, and met Shoko's gaze. You know, sometimes I remember you're kind of a horrible person, she said. And you, my dear, Shoko answered, not even bothering to deny the charge, are far too empathetic. Instead of responding, Momo changed the subject. So, not Lord Denki, she mused. Who else? Lord Tokoyami? Shoko replied. Can't see my father going for it, even if I was interested in tall, dark, and weird. Quirks wouldn't mix well. Momo sighed, conceding the point. The aristocracy was, in many ways, a giant breeding program. They had hoarded the strongest, most useful quirks for generations, passing them down, mixing them carefully, stewarding their power and continually seeking to maximize it. That impulse had produced both of them, half hot half cold in creation alike. They knew better than to discount it, especially where a man like Lord Enji Todoroki was concerned. Lord Sato? Shoko drained her wineglass just at the thought. No. Lord Inasa? Shoko shot Momo a heated look. Then, she burst out laughing. When she finally had control of herself, she simply replied, not in a million years. Momo sighed. Lord Tenya is still unmarried, she said. And after what happened to his older brother, he is the heir presumptive to House Ida. If not for the sobriety of thinking about what had befallen Ida Tensei, Shoko would have laughed again. And he's got a stick up his ass the size of a telephone pole, she shot back. No, thanks. He's the type to go full missionary only, lights off, for reproduction only, and that's just not happening. When I finally get laid, I want it to have some spice, god damn it. Shocked by Shoko's crudeness, Momo snorted into her wine a little bit, a shocking lack of control for a woman like her. You could also call it discipline, she pointed out. Shoko fixed her with a look. You could, she allowed. But I'm very much not. In response, Momo simply sighed. Well, that's just about the list, she declared. Basically, every other man within 5 or so years of us is either engaged or married, at this point. Shoko frowned, working through the numbers in her own head and coming to the same conclusion. Damn, she sighed. That is quite the predicament. Momo shrugged, surprisingly chipper, all things considered. Consider it a challenge, she replied. You do love a good scheme, don't you? Shoko couldn't help but smile at that. Good point, she admitted. That is a silver lining. For a moment, their conversation lapsed again, and before they could resume it, the music abruptly fell quiet, replaced by a bizarre commotion near the great doors that served as entrance to the hall. The two noblewomen looked towards them, confused, eyebrows rising as they finally registered the source of the noise. The herald was leading someone into the ballroom, causing a stir in the crowd as they craned their necks to study the new arrival. The sight reminded Shoko of nothing so much as a pack of hyenas perking up at the approach of new prey. Oh, great, she muttered. Who's it now? Another self-important lordling who needs his ego stroked every time he walks into a room? Beside her, Momo snorted again, only to pause and study the herald more intently. Their balcony above the main hall gave them an excellent vantage point to watch the great doors swing open, hauled apart by immaculately groomed servants. It wouldn't be, the taller girl said softly. There's too much hubbub going on for that. Look, even the dancing has stopped. This is something else. Shoko shrugged, internally, though, she was perking up. Finally, something new. Well, then, she said airily. I suppose we should see what all the fuss is about. A moment later, she got her wish. The herald finally cleared his throat as the hall fell silent. Then, he spoke. May I present Izuku Midoriya, the herald said in his clear, bright voice. Adopted son and heir of Toshinori Yagi. Shoko blinked, feeling her eyes widen as a hurricane of whispers swept through the crowd of nobles. The old man himself, she said, her mind already racing. He finally picked someone? Momo shot her a look. Don't you remember? She asked. It was quite the scandal a few years back. Lord Yagi married a common woman, and adopted her son as his own. Shoko raised an eyebrow. That sounded like Yagi the man had never played by the rules, and he'd always gotten away with it, too, thanks to his vast fortune and political influence that exceeded even her father's. Shoko had always wished she had that sort of freedom. Why haven't we heard of this guy before, though? She shot back. Once again, Momo gave her the patented I know you know this look. Didn't he go abroad? She replied. To America or someplace. Supposedly worked as a mercenary. Shoko snorted. Fat chance of that, she chuckled. Probably did what every heir does when their daddy doesn't want them around, drank and partied his way through half the continent. Momo looked skeptical, but said nothing. Though Shoko didn't expect much, she still found herself leaning over the balcony in curiosity as the great doors opened, quieting the sea of stunned whispers as a man strode in, footsteps impossibly loud in the abrupt silence. A second later, not a voice could be heard in the entire hall. The man who walked in was not the Izuku Midoriya that Shoko could now just barely recall from a handful of social events, some 7 or 8 years back. That Midoriya had been an awkward, timid thing, short and skinny and so visibly uncomfortable among the rich and powerful that he'd been eaten alive by their games Shoko had had to master by the age of 8. This Izuku Midoriya, the one that had just silenced an entire hall of the nobility with his mere presence, shared nothing with his younger self except green hair and a spray of freckles across his cheeks. Now, he was well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a physique so powerfully muscled he looked like he could bench press a car. His hair was close-cropped, now, shorter on the sides than the top, with only a few longer strands to show his natural curls. It wasn't just his physique that had changed, though, even at a distance, Shoko could see the white hairlines of scars on his face and hands. His clothes didn't seem to fit him, they were masterpieces of craftsmanship, tailored personally for him, of course, but they didn't suit him. They hadn't 7 years ago, either, but in an entirely opposite way to now. Back then, the clothes of a noble heir had swallowed him up, had made him look shabby and rumpled and distinctly out of place among a sea of perfect masks. Now, though, he looked out of place, because he was too much for the conservative suit. His body strained at its limits, his mere presence demanded attention from every man and woman in the vast ballroom. Most of all, though, it was the eyes. Shoko had mastered reading people by the age of 12, she could see through any mask, could pick apart a man into his base motivations 100 yards away. And she couldn't read Izuku Midoriya. His green eyes were hard in a way she'd never seen before, guarded and wary, and utterly predatory. This was a man used to fighting for his life at the drop of a hat, used to enemies approaching him with an outstretched hand and a dagger in their sleeve, a man who had fought, had seen the world in ways that the pampered, sheltered lords who ruled Japan could never. As he took in the vast ballroom, Midoriya raised his head, and Shoko swore she felt his eyes lock onto hers, on the balcony above him. She felt a shiver run down her spine, electric and thrilling and wild. Shoko realized, then, that Izuku Midoriya was not a pampered lordling, or a trembling commoner. He was something different, something much more dangerous. She found herself revisiting an earlier analogy: if this ballroom was full of hungry hyenas, then a lion had just strolled in and made himself at home. She felt herself smile. Beside her, Momo watched in confusion, then in dawning fear as Shoko drew herself up to her full height, mismatched eyes gleaming. She knew that look, and what it meant. It meant that Shoko had a new toy to play with. A shame her toys never lasted very long. Well, Shoko murmured, practically licking her lips. Finally, something interesting happened around here. She turned to Momo, gesturing towards the stairs with a roll of her head. Shall we go say hello? The moment Izuku stepped into the ballroom, everything seemed to grind to a halt. It was merely an illusion, he knew that. The music was still playing, the dancers were still twirling. But when the herald stepped away and he was alone before the cutting, accusatory eyes of Japan's aristocracy, for a moment he felt frozen. But the moment passed, and Izuku was not the same scared boy he had been, all those years ago. He took a deep breath, and let his fear pass through him. When it was gone, he found himself calm and collected. As attention shifted slowly away from him, he began to move. Though he wouldn't exactly consider himself an expert in etiquette, he knew the basics of the elaborate dance of protocol, and Toshinori had drilled the specifics of this particular event into him in the week since his return. To start, he went searching for the couple themselves, to pay his respects. The last thing he wanted to do was start a feud or something, before he'd even been back in Japan a month. Luckily, they weren't hard to find. Lord Ejiro and Lady Mina were the center of attention, fielding well-wishers. Those fell silent as he approached, expressions fading until they bore an odd mix of alarm, curiosity, and suspicion. None of those were present on Lord Ejiro's face as he stepped forwards, however. He was beaming, a wide, shark-toothed grin on his face as Izuku stepped forwards. Izuku forced his features into a perfect mask, every inch the dutiful lord as he uttered the lines Toshinori had made him rehearse half to death. Lord Ejiro, he said evenly, extending a hand. It's a pleasure to meet you. My father sends his greetings and his congratulations. Lord Ejiro grinned as he shook Izuku's hand. His grip was firmer than Izuku had expected. Looking closer, he noticed that the man seemed well-built and muscular beneath his formal clothing. Izuku's well-honed skill for assessing men at a glance told him surprisingly favorable things about Lord Ajiro's apparent strength. That was beside the point, though. As they shook, Lord Ajiro laughed. "It's good to meet you too, Lord Izuku, was it? To think, we'd finally get to meet the old man's heir." Izuku grinned, and turned to the other half of the couple. He found Lady Mina smiling, as well, but where her betrothed's grin was guileless and bright, hers was closer to an unreadable smirk, her golden eyes glittering mysteriously. Indeed, she agreed as she held out her hand for Izuku to kiss, something he did with smoothness born mostly of not wanting to fuck up. "I'll admit, you made quite the entrance there, Lord Izuku." Izuku smiled as he drew himself back up to his full height. With an ease he didn't feel, he replied, "What can I say? It's important to make a good first impression." Lady Mina snorted, but didn't say anything else. Izuku soon left the two behind with a polite farewell, letting them go back to their previous conversation. With that out of the way, he had to figure out what to do next. He spotted a waiter carrying a platter of wineglasses through the knots of talking nobles, and thought, why the hell not? Flagging the man down, Izuku picked one of the glasses up for himself, and tasted it. It was surprisingly good, if a little rich for his tastes. Some corner of his mind, though, still finding the whole damn situation hilarious, compared it to the house specials at Mercy's bar, and found it just a little wanting. He'd intended to get up his courage before finding another chance to make some introductions, but it wasn't long before someone else found him. Someone very, very dangerous. Looking up, Izuku realized something worrying. The conversation around him had died fast. Suddenly, he realized why. Like a sea being parted, a passage opened up between the crowds, revealing a woman striding confidently through the gap straight towards him. Izuku's jaw tightened as he recognized her. Then again, it wasn't like that was some great feat. The long two-tone hair running down her back in an elaborate braid made that abundantly clear, along with the red burn scar over her eye. Shoko Todoroki. The most dangerous woman in Japan. The one person Izuku had been specifically instructed to avoid tonight. Shit. He couldn't get his eyes off her as she approached, an inscrutable little smile on her gorgeous face. She was breathtakingly beautiful, tall for a woman and slim, but with mouth-watering curves all the same, her figure flattered by the shimmering blue dress she wore. And the scar, he'd half expected her to hide it, to cover it up with a mask or makeup or something. Instead, she seemed to jut her chin forwards as she walked, as if thrusting it into view, making it impossible to mistake, forcing everyone who looked at her to see what she was. In short, it took all of 2 seconds for every danger sense in Izuku's body, honed by years as a mercenary, to start blaring at him. He realized, then, that he had been wrong. He wasn't prepared for Shoko Todoroki. He never could have been. Izuku forced himself to breathe as she stepped up to them, setting down his wineglass and keeping his hands behind his back, seeming to all the world like he was perfectly calm. Lady Shoko finally came to a stop in front of him. She didn't say a word, and made no move to greet him, instead making a deliberate show of looking him up and down. All around them, people watched nervously, clearly worried about what might happen. Izuku showed nothing on his face, no emotion, and especially not fear. Negotiating with unscrupulous oligarchs, warlords, and paramilitaries had helped him develop one hell of a poker face. He was every bit as unreadable as any noble here when he wanted to be. He simply held Shoko's gaze in return, waiting for her to make the first move, every fiber of his being tensed and ready for shit to go sideways. At long last, she spoke. In a silvery, musical voice, she said, "So, you're the heir to House Yagi, are you?" Izuku raised an eyebrow. "So they tell me," he replied after a moment, his voice a low, contrasting rumble. Shoko snorted. In that same icy tone, she said, "That's not a very lordly answer. Tell me, where did Lord Yagi find you, anyway? An orphanage, or something?" Her brusque, nearly rude tone sent murmurs through the watching nobility, that was dangerously close to an explicit insult, by the standards of these people. Izuku, for his part, felt his mind slow down, nearly to a stop. In those fractions of a second, Izuku considered his options. He could see Shoko's eyes glittering expectantly. That was why she'd done it, he realized. She was provoking him. Testing him, to see how he'd react. How was he going to react? The polite thing to do would be, well, he had no clue what the polite answer to something like that was. And even if he had known, Izuku had acquired quite a few things in America. Money was one of those, more scars than he cared to count another. But worst of all, he'd picked up one hell of a mouth. And that part of him was, unfortunately, the part that tended to come out when he found himself put on the spot. Wordlessly, Izuku reached for his wineglass again, and took a deep, satisfying drink. When he set it back down, he smiled, ever so slightly, as Shoko's insult appeared to all the world to roll off his back like water. "Lady Todoroki, I presume," he said warmly. "A pleasure to meet you. It's lovely to see that all those rumors of your acid tongue were exaggerated." That sent another wave of disturbed mutterings around their audience. Izuku listened to them with no small amount of relish, while waiting for Shoko herself to react. When she did, it was not how he expected. He'd expected irritation, or disdain, or any of the other reactions he recalled from nobles who learned of his commoner background. But that was not what she did. Shoko Todoroki smiled at him. The moment she did, Izuku felt his heart do a funny twist in his chest, because that was a dangerous smile. It was coy and simpering, one corner of her mouth turned upwards as she tilted her head, loose strands of red hair sweeping across her pale, unblemished neck, eyes glittering like deadly ice. Izuku was not used to being looked at the way Shoko looked at him. By the end of his time as Titan, he'd almost forgotten what it was like to not be regarded with fear by everyone he knew sometimes. Even Ochako and Katsuki had seemed wary of him, of the man he'd become after it all. But Shoko looked at him like he was meat, or the way a mad scientist might regard a fascinating new subject they were about to dissect. She tried to hide it, tried to mask the light in her eyes behind polite indifference, but Izuku could see it. She was intrigued, fascinated, she wanted to pick him apart, see what made him tick. And, he kind of liked it. "So," she said, "you do know who I am." With effort, Izuku kept that same easygoing, affable smile on his face. "You are quite infamous, after all. Lady Shoko Todoroki, the Ice Queen. The most powerful noblewoman in Japan." Shoko's smile widened. "The daughter of the second most powerful man in Japan," she corrected. "Oh, and your adoptive father's arch-rival, of course." Izuku raised an eyebrow at that, wondering if it explained the insults, and the dangerous though not quite hostile look in her eye. "Ah," he said. "So I suppose we're enemies, then?" Shoko laughed at that, scarcely more than a giggle, and how even that giggle could be both perfectly ladylike and so thoroughly menacing it made the hair on the back of Izuku's neck stand on end. He didn't want to know and replied easily, "Actually, I was wondering if you'd like a dance." Is that something an enemy would do? There was something worryingly easy about how quickly Izuku responded, how natural it felt to flow with the conversation as he dryly replied, "If I was your enemy, then yes. I'm not a particularly good dancer." Shoko grinned again. "Well, then just do what I say," she suggested, holding out her hand at last. "You'll find that makes things go pretty easily." Izuku considered the offer for a moment. Doing what Shoko Todoroki told him to do sounded like a really stupid idea. But then again, his alternative option was trying to go through some of the women in that fucking binder, which he wanted to do about as much as he wanted to be castrated. The decision was shockingly, perhaps even worryingly easy. He took Shoko's hand, and pressed a kiss to the back of her knuckles. "Somehow, I doubt that," he said as he lifted his head back up. "But I accept." Shoko's mind was whirling as she and Lord Izuku joined the dance floor. She went over their conversation such that it was again and again, trying to figure out what about it had her so intrigued with him. Even as he put his hand on her waist and they began a slow, deliberate waltz, she was analyzing every word, every gesture, every expression. She was still doing it as they danced. She noted that, despite his claim of being a poor dancer, he was actually quite skilled. He seemed to not have an abundance of formal education, but he was light on his feet and exceptionally well balanced. able to move far more skillfully and deftly than a man of his size should have been able to. Shoko recognized this for what it was, a combat skill that translated shockingly well to the rhythmic movement of dance. He was full of little contradictions like that. His facial scars and physical bulk suggested a crude, rough lifestyle, full of violence and brutality.